The quiet neighborhood of Pine Grove had never seen such commotion before. On a sunny Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Rose Thompson, a beloved 98-year-old resident who had lived in her modest blue house for over 6 decades, found herself at the center of an unexpected situation that would soon capture national attention. Mrs. Thompson had been tending to her award-winning garden, something she had done every day since 1960. Her flower beds were legendary in the community, and local schools would often bring children to learn about gardening from her. Despite her age, she maintained an impressive collection of roses, marigolds, and petunias that brought color and life to the entire street. That particular day, she was carefully pruning her roses when a new neighbor, who had recently moved into the area, called the police. The neighbor, unfamiliar with the community and its residents, reported a suspicious person in what they thought was an vacant property. They couldn't have been more wrong about Mrs. Thompson, who was not only the rightful owner but also a pillar of the community. When 2 police officers arrived at the scene, they approached Mrs. Thompson as she stood there, garden shears in hand, wearing her characteristic straw hat and floral apron. The misunderstanding quickly escalated when the officers, without properly assessing the situation, immediately demanded she prove her residence. Mrs. Thompson, slightly hard of hearing and understandably startled by their aggressive tone, couldn't immediately comprehend what was happening. "I've lived here longer than you've been alive, young man," she said calmly, her voice carrying the wisdom of nearly a century. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as the officers, following what they claimed was protocol, insisted on seeing immediate proof of residence. The situation took a distressing turn when one of the officers moved to handcuff Mrs. Thompson, despite protests from gathering neighbors who tried to explain that she was indeed the homeowner. The commotion attracted attention from passers-by, and several people began recording the incident on their phones. As fate would have it, former heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson was in town that day for a charity event at the local community center, just 2 blocks away. A young boy who recognized him at the center ran to tell him about what was happening to Mrs. Thompson, knowing Tyson's reputation for standing up against injustice. The news reached Tyson just as Mrs. Thompson was being guided toward the police car. Without hesitation, he rushed to the scene, his presence immediately drawing attention from everyone present. The legendary boxer, known for his intimidating presence in the ring, approached the situation with unexpected diplomacy and calm. "Hold up, officers," Tyson called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen both the heights of success and the depths of adversity. "This lady right here, she's not just any resident. She's Mrs. Thompson. She's been here since before this neighborhood even had paved roads." Tyson's intervention caused the officers to pause. His presence, combined with the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to support Mrs. Thompson, created a moment of reflection. One of the older residents quickly brought out photographs from a recent community celebration showing Mrs. Thompson being honored for her contributions to the neighborhood, including decades of volunteer work at the local food bank and her role in establishing the community garden program. The power of community was evident as more neighbors stepped forward, each sharing their personal stories about Mrs. Thompson's impact on their lives. They talked about how she had taught generations of children about gardening, how she made soup for sick neighbors, and how her house was always open to anyone who needed help. As the truth unfolded, the officers began to realize their grave error. The situation that had escalated so quickly began to de-escalate, thanks to the combined efforts of Mike Tyson and the community members who stood united in support of their beloved neighbor. What could have been a tragic example of misjudgment and prejudice instead became a powerful demonstration of community solidarity and the importance of taking time to understand situations before jumping to conclusions. The incident would later spark important conversations about community policing and the treatment of elderly citizens, particularly those from minority communities. Through it all, Mrs. Thompson maintained her dignity and grace. Even as the handcuffs were removed and apologies were made, she showed no anger. Instead, she invited everyone, including the officers and the neighbor who had called them, to join her for her famous lemonade and cookies, a gesture that spoke volumes about her character and wisdom gained from nearly a century of life experiences. The following day, Mrs. Thompson's story spread like wildfire across social media. The video clips of her arrest attempt and Mike Tyson's intervention had already garnered millions of views overnight. Local news vans lined Pine Grove Street, but the community formed a protective circle around their beloved neighbor, ensuring she wouldn't be overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Inside her cozy living room, surrounded by old photographs and the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock that had been in her family for generations, Mrs. Thompson sat with Mike Tyson. The unlikely pair had formed an immediate bond. The former heavyweight champion listened intently as she shared stories from her remarkable life, her experiences during the civil rights movement, raising 3 children as a widow, and watching the neighborhood transform over 6 decades. "Young man," she said to Tyson, her eyes twinkling with wisdom, "sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing when not to fight." She poured him another cup of her special chamomile tea, a blend she'd perfected over the years using herbs from her garden. Tyson, known for his fierce persona in the ring, showed a gentle, respectful side that few had seen before. The police department, facing mounting pressure from the viral videos, launched an internal investigation. But Mrs. Thompson had different ideas about how to handle the situation. Instead of pressing charges or demanding punitive action, she proposed something unprecedented, a community reconciliation program. "We need to build bridges, not walls," she explained to the police chief during a meeting at her home. Her solution was simple yet profound. She would host weekly garden sessions where police officers would work alongside community members in her garden and the community green space she had helped establish years ago. The first session attracted curious onlookers. There was something powerful about seeing uniformed officers learning to plant seedlings under Mrs. Thompson's patient guidance. The 2 officers involved in the incident were among the first to participate, their initial embarrassment giving way to genuine engagement as Mrs. Thompson taught them about nurturing growth, both in the garden and in community relationships. Mike Tyson, deeply moved by Mrs. Thompson's approach, decided to extend his stay in town. He began attending the garden sessions regularly, his presence drawing young people from the neighborhood who might otherwise have stayed away. The sight of the former boxing champion carefully tending to delicate flowers alongside elderly community members became a powerful symbol of transformation. The neighbor who had made the initial police call was struggling with guilt and shame. But Mrs. Thompson invited them to her house for Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition she had maintained for decades. Over her famous pot roast and sweet potato pie, she shared stories about the neighborhood's history and the importance of knowing one's neighbors. Local schools began incorporating visits to Mrs. Thompson's garden into their curriculum, not just for botanical education, but for lessons in community building and conflict resolution. Children would sit cross-legged on the grass as she explained how a garden, like a community, needs diversity to thrive. "Every flower has its place," she would say, "and each one makes the garden more beautiful." The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. A local developer who had been planning to build luxury condos in the area instead approached Mrs. Thompson with a different proposal. They wanted to create a community center with a large garden space, named in her honor. The center would focus on bringing together different generations and backgrounds, just as Mrs. Thompson had done throughout her life. The incident even reached the governor's office. Rather than issue a formal statement, the governor chose to visit Mrs. Thompson personally. She welcomed them just as she did everyone else, with fresh lemonade and a tour of her garden. During their conversation, she emphasized the importance of creating spaces where people could learn to understand each other. As weeks passed, the story evolved from one of potential tragedy to one of community transformation. News outlets that had initially focused on the controversy now covered the garden sessions, showcasing how police officers and community members worked side by side, learning from a 98-year-old woman's lifetime of wisdom. Mike Tyson, in a candid interview on the garden bench, reflected on how Mrs. Thompson had changed his perspective. "In the ring, I learned how to fight," he said, wiping soil from his hands. "Here, with Mrs. Thompson, I'm learning how to heal. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who knows how to bring people together." As autumn approached, the impact of Mrs. Thompson's story had spread far beyond Pine Grove. Community leaders from neighboring cities began making pilgrimages to her garden, seeking advice on how to heal their own divided communities. Her simple philosophy of "growth takes patience" resonated with people facing similar challenges across the country. One crisp morning, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected call from a major civil rights organization. They wanted to honor her with a Lifetime Achievement Award, but she had a different idea. Instead of accepting the award herself, she proposed creating a community achievement grant that would fund similar garden-based reconciliation programs in other cities. Mike Tyson, who had found unexpected peace in tending to Mrs. Thompson's garden, decided to match the grant money with his own funds. "Mrs. Thompson taught me that real strength isn't about throwing punches," he shared during a community gathering. "It's about having the courage to plant seeds of change, even when you're not sure they'll grow." The police department, inspired by the transformation in their own ranks, began implementing what they called the Thompson Protocol. Before any confrontational situation, officers were required to take a moment to consider whether they might be dealing with another Mrs. Thompson, a valued community member who deserved patience and understanding rather than immediate judgment. The young officer who had tried to handcuff Mrs. Thompson underwent a particularly profound change. Under her mentorship, he started a youth program that brought together local teenagers and police officers for weekly gardening sessions. The program quickly became popular, with a waiting list of both teens and officers wanting to participate. Mrs. Thompson's house became a sort of unofficial community center. On any given day, you might find city council members discussing policy changes in her kitchen while sampling her famous peach cobbler, or watch as she taught a group of young children how to identify different types of butterflies in her garden. Her age seemed to melt away when she was sharing her knowledge with others. The community garden sessions evolved into something larger than anyone had anticipated. Local chefs began volunteering to teach cooking classes using the harvested vegetables. A retired music teacher started hosting evening concerts in the garden, where classical music mixed with the sounds of nature. The space became a living example of how diversity could create harmony. One particularly touching moment came when a group of elementary school students surprised Mrs. Thompson with a special presentation. They had spent weeks creating an illustrated book about her life, complete with drawings of her garden and quotes from her wisdom. The book, titled "Growing Peace: Lessons from Mrs. Thompson's Garden," would later be published and distributed to schools nationwide. Mike Tyson, who had initially planned to stay only a few days, found himself repeatedly extending his visit. He purchased a small house just down the street from Mrs. Thompson, explaining that he had found more peace in her garden than in all his years of meditation and therapy. His presence continued to draw attention to the community's transformation, but in a way that felt authentic rather than sensational. The neighbor who had made the original police call became one of Mrs. Thompson's most dedicated garden volunteers. Together, they started a welcome program for new residents, ensuring that newcomers would understand and appreciate the rich history and diversity of their community. "Every misunderstanding is an opportunity for growth," Mrs. Thompson would say, her eyes twinkling. Local businesses began to take notice and contribute to the community's transformation. A hardware store donated gardening supplies for the youth program. A tech company provided tablets for documenting the garden's growth and sharing updates with other communities starting similar programs. Even the local coffee shop created a special blend called Mrs. Thompson's Morning Glory, with proceeds going to support community initiatives. The media coverage evolved from focusing on the initial incident to documenting the long-term impact of Mrs. Thompson's approach to community healing. Documentary filmmakers spent weeks capturing the subtle moments of transformation, police officers sharing jokes with teenage volunteers, former rivals working together to build garden beds, and Mrs. Thompson's gentle but firm guidance through it all. During a community celebration marking 6 months since the incident, Mrs. Thompson stood in her garden, surrounded by the diverse group of people who had become part of her extended family. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the flowers, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation in multiple languages. "You see," she said to a group of visitors, pointing to a particularly vibrant flower bed, "this garden was planted by someone who once thought they were my enemy. Now look at how beautifully their flowers bloom alongside mine." That's what happens when you give people room to grow. Winter arrived in Pine Grove, but the warmth of community transformation continued to flourish. Mrs. Thompson's garden, now dormant under a blanket of snow, had given birth to something far more permanent than seasonal blooms. The community center, which started construction in early December, was taking shape rapidly thanks to unprecedented cooperation between local authorities, businesses, and residents. Mike Tyson, who had become an unexpected but permanent fixture in the community, took a particular interest in the center's boxing program. However, this wasn't your typical boxing gym. Following Mrs. Thompson's philosophy, the program combined physical training with gardening and community service. Young people learned that true strength came from building up their community, not just their muscles. Before each boxing session, Tyson explained to a group of enthusiastic teenagers, "We spend time in the greenhouse Mrs. Thompson helped design. There's something about nurturing plants that teaches you patience and control, things I wish I'd learned earlier in my career." The sight of the former heavyweight champion helping young people plant winter vegetables became a regular occurrence. Mrs. Thompson's influence reached the highest levels of law enforcement. The police academy incorporated what they called Thompson training into their curriculum. New recruits now spent time working in community gardens as part of their training, learning to see neighborhoods as living ecosystems rather than just patrol zones. The program was so successful that police departments from other states began sending officers to learn from the Pine Grove model. One snowy morning, Mrs. Thompson received a call that left her speechless for the first time in years. The president had heard about her story and wanted to visit Pine Grove to see the community's transformation firsthand. Rather than hosting a formal ceremony, Mrs. Thompson suggested something different, a community dinner in the greenhouse, where everyone would contribute a dish and share their stories. The Secret Service was initially baffled by the unconventional proposal, but Mrs. Thompson's reputation for bringing people together won them over. "In my 98 years," she told them with a gentle smile, "I've learned that real change happens over shared meals and honest conversation, not formal speeches and photo opportunities." The greenhouse dinner became a symbol of everything the community had achieved. The president sat between Mrs. Thompson and a young teenager who had been one of the first participants in the garden program. Local dishes prepared from greenhouse vegetables filled the long tables, and the steam from hot soups and stews fogged the greenhouse windows, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the high-profile guest. During the dinner, Mrs. Thompson shared her vision for the future. She announced the creation of the Thompson Institute for Community Healing, a program that would train community leaders from across the country in her methods of using gardening as a tool for social transformation. Mike Tyson immediately pledged his support, along with several major foundations that had been watching Pine Grove's progress. The police officers who had been involved in the original incident had become some of the program's strongest advocates. They traveled to other departments, sharing their experiences and the lessons they'd learned. "Mrs. Thompson taught us that law enforcement isn't just about maintaining order," one officer explained during a training session. "It's about nurturing the community, just like you nurture a garden." The winter months brought new challenges and opportunities. When heavy snow threatened to collapse the roof of the old community greenhouse, residents from every corner of Pine Grove came together to build support structures and keep watch through the night. Mrs. Thompson served hot chocolate and told stories about winters from her childhood, turning a potential crisis into another opportunity for community bonding. Local schools began incorporating elements of the Thompson approach into their curriculum. Students spent time learning in the greenhouse during winter months, understanding the science of growing food while also absorbing lessons about patience, care, and community responsibility. Test scores improved, but more importantly, incidents of bullying and behavioral problems decreased significantly. The media attention had evolved into something more meaningful than mere news coverage. A respected documentary filmmaker spent 3 months capturing the daily life of the community, focusing not on the dramatic moments but on the quiet transformations happening every day. The resulting film, Growing Together: The Thompson Legacy, would later win several awards and inspire similar initiatives across the country. As her 99th birthday approached, Mrs. Thompson reflected on the changes she'd witnessed. "When I was young," she told a group of visitors gathered in the greenhouse, "I dreamed of changing the world through my garden. I never imagined that a misunderstanding would lead to all of this." She gestured to the thriving winter vegetables and the diverse group of people tending them together. The community planned a special celebration for her birthday, but in typical Mrs. Thompson fashion, she turned it into an opportunity for giving rather than receiving. She announced the creation of a seed bank that would preserve not just the heritage plants she'd grown over the decades, but also the stories and wisdom she'd collected throughout her life. "Every seed," she explained, "carries the potential for new life, new understanding, and new connections." As spring returned to Pine Grove, the community's transformation had caught the attention of the United Nations. They invited Mrs. Thompson to speak at a special session on community reconciliation, but she had her own way of handling such invitations. Instead of traveling to New York, she invited the UN representatives to visit her garden, believing that true understanding comes from getting your hands in the soil. The UN delegates found themselves in an unusual situation, wearing gardening gloves instead of suits, planting spring bulbs alongside local residents and police officers. Mrs. Thompson supervised from her favorite garden chair, sharing wisdom between sips of her signature lemonade. "You see," she told them, "peace isn't something you can achieve in a conference room. It grows from the ground up, just like these flowers." Mike Tyson, who had become an integral part of the community, started a unique mentorship program combining his boxing experience with Mrs. Thompson's gardening philosophy. Young people would spend mornings in the garden and afternoons in the ring, learning about discipline, respect, and personal growth from both activities. The program quickly gained national attention for its innovative approach to youth development. "Mrs. T taught me something I never learned in the ring," Tyson shared during a community gathering. "She showed me that the toughest person isn't the one who can throw the hardest punch, but the one who can turn an enemy into a friend." His words resonated with many of the young participants who had initially joined just to meet the boxing legend but stayed for the deeper lessons. The Thompson Protocol, now officially adopted by police departments across the country, was showing remarkable results. Cities reported significant decreases in confrontational incidents, and community trust in law enforcement improved dramatically. Police academies began requiring graduates to maintain small gardens at their stations, a physical reminder of Mrs. Thompson's teachings about patience and understanding. Local businesses continued to embrace the community's transformation. The old abandoned factory at the edge of town was converted into an indoor vertical garden, providing fresh produce year-round and jobs for local youth. Mrs. Thompson served as an advisor on the project, ensuring that it maintained the spirit of community connection that had made her garden so special. The neighbor who had initially called the police on Mrs. Thompson had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation. They had become the coordinator of a new program called Know Your Neighbor, which organized block parties, cultural exchanges, and community storytelling events. "Mrs. Thompson taught me that fear often comes from not knowing," they explained during a community meeting. "Now we make sure every new resident feels like part of our family." Spring brought an unexpected honor as a leading university's sociology department began studying what they called the Thompson effect. Researchers documented how simple acts of gardening and community engagement could transform social relationships and reduce systemic tensions. Mrs. Thompson welcomed the academics just as she welcomed everyone else, with a garden tour and an invitation to get their hands dirty. The community center, now complete, became a hub of activity. Its design reflected Mrs. Thompson's philosophy, with classrooms opening onto garden spaces and meeting rooms featuring large windows overlooking the grounds. The building incorporated elements of sustainable architecture, including a rainwater collection system for the gardens and solar panels that provided clean energy for the neighborhood. One morning, as Mrs. Thompson supervised a group of children planting sunflowers, a small girl asked her why she forgave the police officers who had tried to arrest her. Mrs. Thompson's answer captured the attention of everyone within earshot. "Little one," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "holding on to anger is like planting weeds in your garden. They might grow fast and strong, but they'll choke out all the beautiful flowers you could have grown instead." The story of that interaction spread quickly through social media, adding another layer to Mrs. Thompson's growing legacy. Artists began creating murals across the city featuring sunflowers and her words about forgiveness. The images became symbols of hope and transformation in communities facing similar challenges. International delegations started making regular visits to Pine Grove, hoping to learn from what many were calling the garden model of community policing. Mrs. Thompson insisted that these visitors spend at least one full day working in the garden before any formal discussions could take place. "Understanding comes through doing," she would say, handing them gardening gloves with a knowing smile. The original video of her almost arrest, which had gone viral months ago, was now being used in schools and training programs worldwide as a teaching tool. But it was always shown alongside footage of the community's transformation, demonstrating how a potential tragedy had become a catalyst for positive change. As spring bloomed in full force, Mrs. Thompson's garden became more beautiful than ever. The flowers seemed to bloom with extra vigor, as if nature itself was celebrating the peace and harmony that had taken root in Pine Grove. Visitors often remarked that there was something magical about the garden, but Mrs. Thompson would just smile and say, "The only magic here is people learning to grow together." Summer arrived in Pine Grove, bringing with it an unexpected wave of positive change that stretched far beyond the community's borders. Major cities across the country began implementing their own versions of the Thompson Garden Initiative, each adapting Mrs. Thompson's principles to their unique circumstances. Her simple approach to community healing had sparked a nationwide movement. Mike Tyson, who had found such profound peace in Mrs. Thompson's garden, announced the creation of the Tyson-Thompson Youth Foundation. The organization would focus on building garden-based community centers in underserved neighborhoods, combining athletic facilities with green spaces. "Every kid deserves a chance to grow," Tyson explained during the announcement, "both in the ring and in the garden." The foundation's first project broke ground in Tyson's old neighborhood in Brooklyn. Mrs. Thompson, despite her age, insisted on being present for the ceremony. Instead of a traditional groundbreaking with golden shovels, she organized a community planting day. Hundreds of local residents joined her and Tyson in planting the first gardens, creating an immediate sense of ownership and pride in the project. The police department's transformation continued to evolve in remarkable ways. The officers who had once attempted to arrest Mrs. Thompson had become sought-after speakers at law enforcement conferences nationwide. They shared their experiences with a humility that touched their audiences, often ending their presentations by showing photos of their own gardens at home. "Mrs. Thompson taught us that authority doesn't come from a badge," one officer explained during a National Police Chiefs Conference. "It comes from being a trusted part of your community." The audience, initially skeptical, found themselves deeply moved by the sincere transformation they witnessed in their colleagues. Hollywood came calling, wanting to turn Mrs. Thompson's story into a major motion picture. But she had other ideas. Instead of a traditional film, she suggested a documentary series that would focus on similar community transformations happening across the country. "My story is just one seed," she explained to the producers. "The real story is how that seed is spreading and growing everywhere." The documentary team agreed, and their cameras began capturing remarkable stories of change. In Chicago, a former gang territory had been transformed into a community garden. In Houston, police officers were teaching gardening classes in schools. In Los Angeles, rival groups found common ground working together in neighborhood green spaces. Back in Pine Grove, Mrs. Thompson's original garden had become a sort of living classroom. Urban planners, community organizers, and government officials would spend weeks observing and participating in the daily rhythms of the garden. They learned that true community transformation couldn't be rushed, it needed to grow organically, just like the plants they tended. The summer heat brought new challenges and opportunities. When a severe drought threatened the community gardens, residents organized a sophisticated water conservation system. People shared resources, adjusted planting schedules, and worked together to protect their precious green spaces. The crisis brought them even closer together, proving that their community's roots had grown deep and strong. Mrs. Thompson's health began to show signs of her age, but her spirit remained as vibrant as ever. She started recording her gardening wisdom and life stories, creating a living archive of knowledge for future generations. Young people would sit with her for hours, recording her memories and insights on everything from companion planting to conflict resolution. "You see that butterfly bush," she would say to her young listeners, pointing to a flourishing plant near her porch. "It started as a tiny seed, just like our community's transformation. But with patience, care, and the right conditions, look how it draws beautiful creatures to it now." The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone who heard it. The Thompson Institute for Community Healing launched its first formal training program, bringing together community leaders from 50 different cities. The curriculum combined practical gardening skills with deep lessons about community building and conflict resolution. Mrs. Thompson insisted that every participant spend time working directly with community members, not just studying theory. One particularly touching moment came when a group of international peacekeepers visited Pine Grove. These hardened veterans of conflict zones found themselves moved to tears by the simple power of Mrs. Thompson's approach. "We've tried so many complex solutions," one peacekeeper admitted, "but maybe the answer has been as simple as a garden all along." The local economy began to reflect the community's transformation. New businesses opened that aligned with Mrs. Thompson's values: garden supply stores, farm-to-table restaurants, and educational centers. But more importantly, existing businesses began incorporating community gardens into their operations. The local bank created a rooftop garden for employees, and the shopping center installed planters that were maintained by local youth groups. As summer reached its peak, Mrs. Thompson received news that her story had inspired change in unexpected places. Prisons began implementing gardening programs, schools across the country were adding garden-based learning to their curricula, and corporate offices were creating green spaces for employee wellness. Her vision of using gardens as tools for social transformation had taken root in ways she never imagined. "Every garden tells a story," she would say to visitors, her eyes twinkling with joy. "But the most beautiful story is the one we're all writing together, one seed at a time." As autumn returned to Pine Grove, bringing its palette of golden hues and crisp mornings, the community prepared for a momentous occasion, Mrs. Thompson's 99th birthday celebration. But true to her nature, she transformed what could have been a simple party into something far more meaningful: a national conference on community healing through urban agriculture. The event, hosted in the newly completed Thompson Community Center, drew participants from all 50 states and 12 countries. Mike Tyson, who had become like a son to Mrs. Thompson, took personal charge of the arrangements. He wanted everything to reflect the elegant simplicity that had made her approach so effective. "A year ago, I came here thinking I was just stopping by," Tyson shared during the opening ceremony. "But Mrs. Thompson showed me that sometimes the biggest changes in life come from the smallest gardens." His words resonated with the assembled crowd, many of whom had similar stories of unexpected transformation. The conference featured something unique. Instead of traditional presentations, sessions were held in the gardens. Speakers had to demonstrate their community-building techniques while actively gardening alongside their audience. Mrs. Thompson had insisted on this format, saying, "True understanding grows better in a garden than in a conference room." One of the most powerful moments came when the police officers involved in the original incident led a session on law enforcement transformation. They worked alongside community members, planting fall vegetables while discussing how their approach to policing had fundamentally changed. Before meeting Mrs. Thompson, one officer shared, his hands deep in the soil, "I saw my job as maintaining order. Now I see it as nurturing community growth." The sight of uniformed officers teaching gardening techniques to other law enforcement professionals from around the country became a powerful symbol of change. The Thompson Protocol had by now been implemented in over 500 police departments nationwide. Early statistics showed remarkable results: significant decreases in confrontational incidents, improved community relations, and better mental health outcomes for officers. But beyond the numbers, there were countless stories of personal transformation. During the conference, Mrs. Thompson unveiled her latest initiative, the Garden of Second Chances. The program would establish community gardens near courthouses and police stations nationwide, providing spaces for peaceful resolution of community conflicts. The idea had already gained support from several state Supreme Courts. Every garden, Mrs. Thompson explained to a group of judges and legal professionals, is a place of continuous second chances. Seeds that don't sprout in spring might flourish in fall. Plants that struggle in one spot might thrive in another. Nature teaches us that everyone deserves another opportunity to grow. The media coverage of the conference took an unexpected turn when several major networks decided to broadcast their morning shows live from Mrs. Thompson's garden. Viewers across the country watched as news anchors traded their suits for gardening clothes and worked alongside community members while conducting interviews. One touching segment featured a reunion between Mrs. Thompson and the neighbor who had initially called the police. Together, they demonstrated how to plant bulbs for spring, their easy conversation and genuine friendship serving as a powerful testament to the possibility of transformation. The tech industry also took notice of Mrs. Thompson's approach. A leading social media company developed an app that helped communities establish and maintain their own garden-based reconciliation programs. The app included features for sharing knowledge, coordinating volunteers, and tracking the impact of community gardens on local crime rates and social cohesion. Mrs. Thompson's health remained strong, but she had begun to focus more on ensuring her legacy would continue. She worked with local universities to develop a curriculum that would be taught in schools of social work, law enforcement, and urban planning. The program would help future professionals understand the role of community spaces in social healing. The conference culminated in an evening celebration that brought together all the elements of Mrs. Thompson's vision. Tables were set up throughout the gardens, where people from all walks of life shared meals they had prepared using vegetables they had grown together. The atmosphere was one of joy, unity, and possibility. During the celebration, Mike Tyson made a surprising announcement. The Tyson-Thompson Youth Foundation would be expanding internationally, with plans to establish community gardens in conflict zones around the world. "Mrs. Thompson taught us that peace grows from the ground up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's time to plant these seeds of peace everywhere." As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite garden chair, surveying the scene before her. Children played among the flowers while their parents chatted with neighbors. Police officers and community members shared stories over dessert. The garden was alive with the sound of laughter and conversation in multiple languages. A young journalist asked her if she ever imagined her garden would have such an impact. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom and joy. "Every garden starts with a single seed," she replied, "but if you plant it with love and tend it with patience, there's no limit to how far its fruits can spread." Winter had returned to Pine Grove, bringing with it a blanket of pristine snow and a sense of completion to an extraordinary year. The garden where it all began lay dormant under the frost, but the seeds of change that had been planted continued to flourish in ways no one could have predicted. Mrs. Thompson, now approaching her centennial year, had just received news that left her momentarily speechless. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee had announced her nomination for the upcoming year's award. The nomination cited her revolutionary approach to community healing and the measurable impact of the Thompson Protocol. Across the globe, Mike Tyson, who had remained a faithful friend and supporter, was the first to congratulate her. "You didn't just teach us how to grow gardens," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You taught us how to grow peace." The former boxing champion had transformed his own life so completely that he was now being considered for a position on the Presidential Council for Community Relations. The Thompson Protocol had exceeded all expectations. Police departments implementing the program reported a 70% decrease in confrontational incidents and a 85% improvement in community relations. The original officers involved in Mrs. Thompson's incident had become international consultants, helping law enforcement agencies worldwide integrate community gardening into their training programs. One cold morning, Mrs. Thompson received a surprise visit from a group of United Nations peacekeepers. They had successfully used her gardening approach to help reconcile communities in former conflict zones. In regions where traditional peacekeeping methods had failed, the simple act of working together in community gardens had begun to heal decades-old wounds. "We've seen enemies become friends over tomato plants," one peacekeeper explained, sharing photos of former militia members working side by side in gardens. "Your method succeeds where arms and diplomacy fail because it gives people a chance to grow something together." The Thompson Community Center had become a model for similar facilities worldwide. Its unique design, combining indoor and outdoor spaces for year-round community engagement, was being replicated in cities across the globe. During the winter months, the center's massive greenhouse became a gathering place where the community's warmth defied the cold outside. The documentary series about Mrs. Thompson's impact had begun airing internationally, translated into 47 languages. Each episode showcased a different community that had adopted her approach, from inner-city neighborhoods to rural towns, proving that her methods could work in any setting. The series became required viewing in police academies and social work programs worldwide. Technology continued to play an unexpected role in spreading Mrs. Thompson's message. The garden tracking app had evolved into a global platform for community healing initiatives. Users could connect with other communities, share success stories, and access resources for starting their own programs. The app had been downloaded millions of times, creating a digital network of garden-based peace builders. Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, whose call to police had inadvertently sparked this movement, had become a key figure in the foundation's work. They traveled the country, sharing their story of transformation and teaching others how to overcome prejudice through community engagement. "Mrs. Thompson showed me that fear is just ignorance in need of some gardening," they would often say. The Tyson-Thompson Youth Foundation had exceeded all expectations. Their programs now operated in over 1,000 locations worldwide, combining sports training with community gardening to help young people develop both physical and social skills. The foundation's success rates in reducing youth violence and improving community cohesion had caught the attention of governments worldwide. One particularly touching development came when the police academy announced that their new training facility would be named the Thompson Garden of Justice. The facility featured extensive gardens where future officers would spend time working alongside community members as part of their basic training. Mrs. Thompson had helped design the curriculum herself, ensuring that each officer would understand the power of community connection. As winter deepened, Mrs. Thompson spent more time in the community center's greenhouse, sharing her wisdom with an ever-growing audience. She had begun working on a book, not just about gardening techniques, but about the deeper lessons she had learned in her nearly century of life. "You see," she told a group of visiting diplomats one snowy afternoon, "every garden teaches us the same lessons. We must prepare the soil carefully, plant with hope, tend with patience, and trust in the process of growth. Communities are no different, they just need the right conditions to flourish. The year's events had come full circle. The incident that could have ended tragically had instead sparked a global movement for peace and understanding. Mrs. Thompson's garden had grown far beyond its physical boundaries, becoming a symbol of hope and transformation for communities worldwide. On a quiet evening, as snow fell gently outside, Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite chair in the greenhouse, surrounded by the next generation of community leaders she had helped cultivate. Young people from around the world had come to learn from her, each planning to take her methods back to their own communities. Remember, she told them, her voice soft but clear, the most beautiful gardens are the ones where everyone has a place to grow. When we plant seeds of understanding, tend them with patience, and nurture them with love, we create something far more precious than flowers, we create harmony. As she looked out at the snow-covered garden where it all began, Mrs. Thompson smiled, knowing that the seeds of change she had planted would continue to grow long after the snow melted, bringing hope and healing to communities around the world, one garden at a time.